Chapter 81, Village Center, Part 1. Baron stared at the now empty pot with regret, and it was only now that he had the mind to return to the previous topic. "You've been to the other side of this place?" he asked. "Then do you know where the village center is?" The others looked at him with interest. Baron continued speaking. "Other than looking for you guys, we were also walking around, determining where it is after we saw the announcement. My cousin is an engineer, but she didn't really practice much. Her hobby was mostly carpentry. She auctioned off a number of special resin tables and carved furniture. Baron sold his cousin proudly like it was all his achievements. She's living in the other house though. She was injured a bit during our final run before arrows from the towers killed the monsters chasing us." Sheila, Harold, and the others nodded. They remembered this person. She was very strong, standing tall even when her body was gushing with blood. Fortunately, Sheila was a nurse and always had homeostatic medicine in her space, so she survived. "I'm a businessman. I pretty much loved money my whole life. Since we are here, I hope to see the opportunities here and still live well with my loved ones." Harold looked at Althea, who nodded in response. As such, the old man continued to be the spokesperson of the team. "We were actually thinking of renting a few stores ourselves." Baron's eyes brightened, eyes zoning on Sheila, who cringed. "Shall we go together then?" he asked with a weird smile. Maury time to bond with his angel. As they walked along the large pathway, they couldn't help but admire the surroundings. Because of the lack of development and population, there was little difference outside and inside the wall. For the most part, it was all forests. However, the main difference was that there were large carriageways and sidewalks with trees in between them. This pathwalk, framed by the tree canopies and plants, actually made for a visual treat. Speaking of beauty, the young men couldn't help but steal a glance at a certain pregnant woman. To their surprise, they saw Althea was clicking on the air. They couldn't help but ask, "What are you doing?" "I'm arranging my space," Althea lied without blinking, and the two men shrugged, believing her. What Althea was actually doing was setting up the village center before they got there. Ignoring other people's gazes, she continued to manipulate the window as she walked. The village center window had a total of a number of 5 tabs available for use. First was the inquiry window, where people could gather some information for a price. Next, a purchase window, where people could sell certain items to the territory. Then there was the missions window, where missions set by the territory or others could be seen and set. There was the announcement window, which would serve as her bulletin board to list down announcements that she had made. This was followed by a properties window, probably related to the rental and purchase of different buildings. And finally, for the inquiry window, it would serve as the FAQ page on web pages. This would be blank for now, and she will be publicizing several rules she set before at the same time. People could also post their own inquiries to be answered by the public. She set the price for 1 silver coin. She was also planning on taking advantage of a loophole and allowing people to sell information here as well. The purchase window was the most important to her at the moment. At level 1, she could only set purchases for 3 items: wood, stone, and a free slot for something else. Based on the approximate productivity of weaker people, as well as the valuation of buildings that used the resources, she had decided on buying 1 unit of stone for 10 copper coins and wood for 5. As for the final slot for purchase, she decided to make it vague to try a loophole and decided on plant items. She smiled when it got approved and set it for 1 handful or a piece of plant for 0.1 to 1 copper coin. Because the plants within the territory were protected, this meant that the people had to go outside for this. She fairly placed a much higher price per volume compared to the other 2 because of this. Adding up, the buying price for this would be a bit bigger than the others, which wasn't a bad deal for people who had no idea what the use of the plants was. There would also be lucky purchases, in which case she would really earn money. Her stomach was simply too big now with the occasional contractions. She really couldn't bear to squat down for long periods of time anymore. As for the final property tabs, she simply inputted the previous pricing she had decided. That was 1 detached house, 110, set rented for 200 copper a day, purchased for 50 gold. Duplex houses 210, rented at 100 copper per day, and sold for 30 gold. The dorm-type bed spaces, 32-240, was 1 copper per day. Farm villas 3-3 would be rented for 5 silver or 500 copper a day and bought for 100 gold. For commercial 0-10, the cost was only a bit higher than the detached houses for rent, because the only difference was the additional customization. The mixed-use buildings were rented or bought on a per-unit basis. That was to say, if they hoped to own the commercial spot, they'd also have to buy the unit above. As a benefit of contributing to the economy, she set the rental price at almost the same price as a detached house. She nodded, this was fair. She got her gold in various multiples of investment, and the buyers would be buying a comfortable life. Very fair indeed. As for purchasing the commercial unit, though, because they were prime spaces, she couldn't bear to set the same price. So she set it to quite a bit more residential units at 80 gold. She believed in her territory. Anyone who invested in real estate in her land would definitely profit from it. This was her promise. Chapter 82, Village Center, Part 2. The custom building used for commercial purposes was especially interesting, primarily because of the inherent flexibility she could use it with. Except for the requirement that a unit must have at least one room to be used as a residence, a limitation to her custom building, everything else would be entirely up to them. They could choose whether to use a floor or the whole building, or even just a room for business. In fact, she had already seen something like this, where they chose to designate a single room adjacent to the street. People would just go to this takeout window and go on their way. Everything was all done very easily too. One option was for the citizens to just go to the building they hoped to use, assuming it was unowned, and the window for rental or purchase will appear. The advantage of settling in the village center was the distribution map was visible, as well as the option to do minor customizations, for a small cost, of course. Anyway, none of these considerations were heard by the other people. They were chattering about their experiences before reaching the territory. It took about half an hour of leisure walking until they finally reached the center of the village. The village center was about 5 meters in height and had similar style to the residential buildings. It was surrounded by a large open space with sparse trees. Behind it was a simpler building and similarly large in area. They saw there were also a few more people heading inside, and the group followed them in. Unlike the houses that had a homely feel to it, the design of the village center was a bit more sophisticated. There were cornices and accent walls. There were moldings that lined the edges and corners. It had an open plan and high ceilings, and there was a huge chandelier-like feature in the middle, made of Yuli stone and some other shiny reflective stones they managed to get in small quantities. There was no electricity, but there was a skylight above that transmitted lighting, whether it was the sun or the 2 moons, to the fixture, making it glow. At night, a torch could be safely lit in these areas, as the Yuli stone was fire retardant and would not get burned. If she could find good oil, she could also extend the lighting hours of these torches, which would allow for some degree of nightlife in the territory. But all these were things for the future, not today. Back to the village center, the group continued to study the new building type. On the floor there was no counter, only elevated marble surfaces that occupied a third of the space, as well as panels about the size of a door lined up facing opposite each other. The marble surfaces were 1 meter diameter white surfaces at the height of cocktail tables equidistant to each other, while the panels were of the same material but were standing upright. A few of the surfaces were already occupied by people. There are updates. New windows had opened. They buy 1 unit of wood for 5 copper. One of the people from before yelled as he stood in front of one of the tables. How much could we earn a day? Let's try it out then. What if we cut trees? How much wood would that give? This made Althea frown, forgetting about this issue. Althea then made a mental note to publicize one of her rules. Cutting trees in her territory is forbidden unless expressly allowed by the territory. Also, when cutting trees outside, they shall also plant at least 3 seedlings in replacement. Although Terran had somewhat recovered a bit from the destruction of nature of their predecessors, the damage had been done and too much had been lost. As a plant enthusiast, she was determined for sustainable development. Mori people sold some twigs and plants and others. Some were accepted, some were not. Someone even tried to sell a random item from the space. It was a wrapper. His stance was hopeful, but his shoulder slumped a moment later. Or not accepted. Only a sufficient amount of wood, stone and plants were accepted. Someone tried to sell a random fruit peel and fruit cores. Got accepted. I only earned 0.3 copper. Why do you have that? I was afraid the smell of what I ate would attract monsters or something. Althea actually allowed trash like this to be sold, because as a plant expert she knew every part of a plant had its use. She may even get unexpected seeds from this. While she'd be throwing many of these to compost pits in the end, it would be a pity to miss a few good ones that might actually appear. Well, you earned from recycling. The friends laughed and amused many of the people around. Soon, the people started occupying the free panels. Seeing this activity, their party was eager to join in. They separated and went to separate surfaces, some in front of the marble, while she and a few others on the upright panels. Welcome to the village center. Announcements, inquiries, properties, rentals, purchasing, missions. Althea watched as the people used the panels on their own, without the system bothering her at all. She nodded in relief. It seemed that this building could function on its own, as long as she set it up properly. She studied the panel and mused about some improvements. At the same time, she also received various notifications. Received 100 copper. Received 1 copper. Received 1 copper. Received 200 copper. While nice at first, she couldn't imagine what it would be like when there were more people, or if she heard these dings inside her head all day long. Fortunately, even notification settings could be personalized. She decided to place a threshold for notifications, a minimum of 10 gold transactions, and delay notifications at night. Received 30 gold. Received 50 gold. Received 50 gold. Althea smiled brightly. People had definitely started purchasing properties. Sure enough, real estate was the best. Chapter 83, Newcomers. More and more people dealt with real estate, and Baron was rushing to get hands on it. Got it, he yelled as he bought another property. Why is there a purchase limit for the commercial areas though? Angelo looked over his panel and pointed at a text. Didn't you see the number? There's only 10 at most per building type. I.e., Baron mumbled, disappointed. However, this wasn't bad, as he shouldn't be putting all his eggs in one basket anyway. Anyway, 3 months is waived. I will start my business now. More and more people arrived at the village center, and more pings and cha-chings sounded in her ears. She frowned. As much as she liked the sound, it was much too distracting. She changed the notifications, and now allowed for money-related things 50 gold or above. As she perused the panel, she saw that Sheila and Harold had bought 1 commercial building each using Baron's payment. This was because she had insisted for them to keep the reward, as they deserved it, and she would just receive the profit sharing she deserved. In less than 10 minutes, all 10 commercial spaces have either been bought or rented out. She pondered whether to build a few more but stopped herself, recalling the pitiful state of her stocked resource. As a hoarder, she could not stomach emptying her stocks. Her rule of thumb was that at least a third of the maximum capacity was maintained. So she decided to replenish her resources first before anything else. Anyway, the accommodation was just enough to serve hundreds of people. Speaking of which, when were the other people coming? A few kilometers away from Althea. The ones who ran after the fireworks the previous night were actually the minority. Most people who had seen the fireworks the previous night simply couldn't go out because of the darkness. After all, how many people managed to bring flashlights or similar tools to their space? However, they made sure to take note of the direction and headed there at daybreak. Mathilda's party was among these people. Mathilda habitually placed her palms over each other, hovering just above her stomach. Her sharp black eyes looked at her companions, studying if there was more to prepare. There were 24 of them remaining from the original 100, and they came from 3 different cities in Terran. When everyone had packed up and prepared, they looked at Mathilda, waiting for her instructions. Go! As such, the group began moving towards a direction. Even if she was one of the oldest and weakest in the group, as a retired but acclaimed politician, everyone still respected her. Not to mention she had saved a lot of lives with her planning and strategies. This gave her a lot of leverage and respect. The group trekked for several minutes, makeshift weapons out and ready to fight. They knew that there had never been an hour wherein their big group hadn't encountered a few monsters. Sure enough, about half an hour later, a small mob of about 20 monsters appeared, attracted by their scents. But they were a relatively solid group, and while they were still afraid and chilled, no one broke formation and panicked. They had faith in their leaders. The person who led the team's forces and fights was a man called Drake, a young man with well-toned shape, dashing aura, and relatively good looks. He was also another reason why Mathilda held the position of power. Drake, as her bodyguard, followed her orders to the T. "Fight," he yelled as soon as one monster made a move. He led the team to fight, swinging his machete cleanly and accurately. Similarly, the others quickly mobilized at the sound, forming their predetermined teams to deal with the monsters. Drake used a tree as catapult, propelling his body towards the obvious leader of the mob. He used a skill-learned, parry LV1 to hit its neck, making it angry. With this attack, a lot of the aggressiveness was directed to Drake, as they planned. The monster the size of his chest roared and its heavy feet moved towards him, creating small vibrations on the ground nearby. He used his skills repeatedly to deal with the monster, his accuracy for its weak spots increasing with every hit. Eventually, it fell and the rest of the mobs were markedly easier to deal with. It was very thrilling and there were many injuries, but there were no casualties. In fact, half of the monsters were dealt with by one person, with him rescuing people as needed. In terms of protection, it could be said that Drake was the anchor of the group, and as someone he followed, Mathilda was the owner of this anchor. Drake was in the middle of level 4 now, way ahead of the others. He was a veteran who was unfortunately injured and was disqualified from service. Of course, his former Special Forces team fought for benefits, and they won it for him. Unfortunately, Drake was not only taken away from the job he liked, he could no longer take normal jobs as well. It was just that the improved physiques after the apocalypse helped him ignore his shortcomings. They rested for a while, treating their wounds, and consuming little food that they had left. Fortunately, they had already determined a couple of edible plants in the vicinity, so no one starved to death. There was also a botany student who had some idea of how to determine which was poisonous. He wasn't always accurate, but he definitely saved a few lives. They had also managed to find water in a creek a day prior, thanks to Drake's mountaineering experience, though they had to disinfect it several times to be safe. After resting, the group continued on their way across the difficult terrain, crossing the hills and dense undergrowth. It was very tedious, taking them hours to reach a place that could be walked for less than an hour on foot, on flat land. The next leg of the journey to the fireworks was relatively uneventful, except for the monster hordes that attacked them every so often. But with Drake's leadership, no one was sacrificed. When they finally saw the walls, their legs almost gave out in relief. They almost ran to find the closest gate, and seeing it was open, immediately ran in. "You have arrived at Althea village, welcome." They almost cried at the notifications, and they looked eagerly at the announcements that followed. "The entry is only 5 copper, one said, paying without thinking, and everyone else did the same. Excited, they entered the gate filled with hope, to finally see civilization, finally eat well, maybe even bathe. Maybe they could even see brethren, maybe see their families and friends. It was just that, inside the majestic walls were endless forests. Chapter 84, Mathilda. Well, not exactly. After getting over the site, they realized there was a really wide paved road in front of them. There were about 6 lanes divided in half by trees and landscaping. There were even a few meters of elevated sidewalks on the sides, also lined with trees. Although there were no cars, they walked out of the carriageway and started walking along the colored sidewalk. It was odd to see such wide avenues in the middle of the forest, but it was a human construction, and it was enough. After all, a pathwalk must lead to somewhere, right? Right. Anyway, it took them about 10 minutes of hopeful walking before they could finally see buildings. And they finally felt their hearts get in place. At this time, Althea was looking at the screen as she saw something interesting. She saw a new person in the population page, with the former job indicating politician in green font. Mathilda Cruz. Among the scores of people in the territory, except for her, only 2 people had the green font. One of whom was Eugene, and the other was a 40-year-old man named Cook with the talent for cooking. This man had been one of the people who bought a commercial space, likely to be used as a restaurant. It could be said that people with green fonts represent the pinnacle of their professions. Thinking of it this way, poor Eugene really lived miserably for someone with such achievements. More importantly, she also knew this person, the retired Minister of Foreign Affairs, famous for her feat in the Utah country next to their Eden country. Due to centuries of exploitation, the planet's natural resources had been used up. When a mineral resource was found between the borders, war almost broke out. Mathilda went and stopped it, even winning their country very good terms. She also knew Mathilda personally. She could be loosely considered a familial elder of hers. They had met through her youngest son, Gil, her husband's right-hand man, and they had met several times in events and official parties. They had only gotten close from there. It was very amusing how a tactless guy with such poisonous mouth came out of a famous diplomat's stomach. She added 2 more farm villas and 4 more duplex residential units to comfortably accommodate the newcomers. "I heard there are newcomers, shall we take a look?" Sheila said, looking gossipy. Althea nodded and followed the girl out of the village center, with Harold and Eugene following closely behind them. They stood at the square and watched the scores of newcomers appear in their sights with various emotions, especially when they saw people with aura among them. "That firework was a very good idea, Eugene," Althea said to Eugene, who sheepishly rubbed his curly hair in embarrassment. "I would love to make contributions, boss." Seeing him shy, Sheila couldn't help but giggle at him. She looked at Althea. "Boss, if your compliments could be currency." This made Althea think. "Contributions, eh?" Althea, a woman from the crowd, called, breaking their conversation. At this voice, Althea wordlessly walked forward to meet them. Althea smiled as she approached, her poise calm and collected, but the brightness in her eyes betrayed her excitement. "Auntie," she paused and looked beside her. "Drake." The man blushed in embarrassment, and Mathilda looked at them in amusement, knowing the usually brave young man's weakness towards women. She then stepped forward and held her hand. She then turned to her companions. "Get settled first, I will find you." The people looked at each other and then to Drake, who looked at the younger girl in embarrassment. Althea smiled, pointing at the village center's door. "Just go inside, you'll be able to rent or purchase a place of stay." "Thank you," he said, and the others followed her, though not before stealing glances of the beautiful Althea. "I'm sorry for the impoliteness," Mathilda said as her sharp eyes watched her team enter the building. "Would you like to stay with me temporarily? We have a lot to talk about." "We sure do," she paused, giving her a vague look. Althea," she voiced out to no one in particular. Althea only smiled as if it had nothing to do with her. "Well, I seem to have a destiny with this territory." Mathilda just smiled and nodded. Althea looked at the older woman with a similar smile. If there were others watching them, they'd just be very confused. Hey, just like old times. Although there was no furniture, it was still much more comfortable than in the open sun. There were also hotel pillows to sit on. Behind closed doors, Mathilda let go of her intimidating aura, finally relaxing. She held Althea's hand as soon as she sat next to her. Her strict, unapproachable aura softened considerably, turning to a mother hen. "How are you, child?" she asked and looked at her protruding belly. Her eyebrows furrowed and she frowned, looking heartbroken. "How wronged you are. You must have suffered greatly the past few days." Althea shook her head and smiled, comforting. "I'm fine, Auntie. I was in the villa area when it happened. I'm very well now. The territory is fine." Speaking of the territory, Mathilda's worry eased and she looked at her with a smile. I agree, you built it well." Althea touched her nose, a bit shy. "Don't worry, your secret is safe with me," the old woman just said, looking melancholic. "It's good to hide this power. People tend to blame those in power when they're accessible." Then, as if recalling painful memories, Mathilda heaved a sigh. If only Garin and Gil were here. The old woman's voice cracked when she mentioned her son's name. "You wouldn't have had to take this burden in your condition." This time it was Althea who held the other's hand. Mathilda had been the strongest voice in finding the soldiers. The reason she retired was because she couldn't handle the pain of losing her son. Althea thought for a while before saying anything, and decided to tell her intuition regardless. "I feel they should be here," she told her. My gut tells me he is closer to me than the past few months. Since she got here, she had occasional dreams. She never remembered any of them, but the feeling after she woke up was similar to the feeling of comfort when she was with her husband. Mathilda's furrowed eyebrows stretched to one of surprise, and she looked at Althea hopefully. The younger woman just wrapped her arms around the older woman. Gil will be fine, they both will. Mathilda embraced the young woman. I believe so too. Chapter 85, Inquiries. Roland Mercenaries' headquarters, Twinwave Town. In the midst of a mountain range, rolling hills and dense forests, laid a prosperous large town. It was a town that took advantage of its position in rough terrain and its proximity to various cities and towns. It had direct economic connections to 9 villages, 3 towns, and a city, because one had to pass through this town to get to anywhere of these territories. It had relatively wide roads of about 5 meters each lane, with people and carriages abound chatting and creating a cacophony of noises that characterized a lively population. Walking along these streets, one would appreciate the overall appearance of the town. The buildings were in the continent's usual construction of wood, of typical post and beam construction, but each one had differences hand-customized by the residents, showing signs of life and differing personalities. The largest building was the 5-story town center, and the rest of the buildings leading to it were 2-story houses, serving as its willing foil. There were, of course, a few sets of buildings larger in size than the others, and these were all purchases by large organizations. At the moment, a certain Terran was completing a deal inside one. Here, 340 gold. Bart handed the bag to Garen with a smile. Garen took the gold with a light attitude. Thanks, he paused, separating a third of the amount and handed them back. If you have any more missions, or information about that matter. Bart smiled and took the bribe. Yes, we're contacting our teams that came back from more distant territories. Perhaps they have news. Thank you. Garen stood up and left, leaving the mercenary team's headquarters to meet his team at the inn. He temporarily placed the money in his space, planning on how much they needed to keep. This amount of gold could actually let the entire team live well for a month or two in a small town. However, the cost of travel and payment of informants weren't cheap. One channel, Bart, already took a bulk of 2 weeks' income, so even after earning good money, they had to live very frugally. Of course, except for a few, no one complained. After all, they all want to go home. However, an occasional treat was still okay. He called the team to eat out, surprising them to no end. Garen and the team went to the town's advanced restaurant nearby. It offered one of the rare decent meals this place offered, grilled mastia, some sort of mutton that was marinated in a secret sauce. It was nothing special compared to their Terran dishes, but it was one of the edible offerings this place had. He also chose 2 other dishes to complement. His team brightened up at the sight of food delivered. Thanks, boss, the youngest Lewis expressed in glee as he stared at the sumptuous meals in front of him. How long did he have 3 plates to choose from? Gil rolled his eyes but gracefully ate the food. Tusk couldn't compare to the captain's or any of Terran dishes at all, but the boss was rarely generous, so he shall enjoy it nevertheless. Garen nodded and ate his meal, also appreciating the rare treat. His wife always told him to balance things, not only focused on work, but also add a bit of break and graciousness. Not only for him, but also for the morale of the team. Looking at the team lively around the table, Garen smiled to himself. As always, his wife was always right. About an hour later, the satisfied team went back to the temporary home base. This temporary house was a dwelling they rented a few weeks prior. After settling down, Garen called them so they could start planning on the budgeting of the items again, like a proper democracy. We keep 200 gold as living expenses this month. A small town typically needed 10 gold per person a month to somehow live like a human being. They just required this amount for themselves. The 20 of them were sharing a 100 SQM room, with the only girl living with other Aboriginal girls next door. The remaining would be sent, as always, to the Mercenary Union for information. A few foreign soldiers frowned a bit displeased about the amount they'd be keeping. No one complained. After all, everyone wanted to go home. And there was also the fact that they personally earned just enough for themselves. The money invested for information was mostly the captain's money, and they were just freeloading. However, everyone did make a point to share those moments when they started making money and sharing it with a colleague. The next day, Garen and Gil went to the mercenary union. It was a 3-story building made of stone, and it had a large door about 3 meters. They walked to the counter to see a bulky man with a bushy beard. "Jones, any news on odd phenomenons the past few months?" Gil asked, like, say, space distortions. Jones took the money. "Well, there's no space distortions, but there really was something odd." He paused and stopped talking. Garen, on cue, added a few more gold. "A beast tide occurred a few days back, and several unconnected territories were hit," the man said and stopped indifferently. "That's all we know for now. They have just finished dealing with most of the swarm, and now several forces are still investigating the cause of it at the moment." Garen and Gil shared a look, wondering if this was truly all they could get from this trip. However, from his peripheral vision, Garen couldn't help but notice the old slave wiping the floor vigorously a few meters away. If he remembered correctly, this person was twice as far from him a few seconds prior. The man lifted his head, meeting his eyes. The two shared a flash of communication, making Garen pause, understanding this man wanted to tell him something. Although the man's eyes were lifeless and devoid of hope, there was still a hint of confidence. It was as if he really had something to offer. And Garen always trusted his guts. Chapter 86, Clue to Althea. Garen did not call him out immediately, however, simply because, judging by the special mineral cuff on his neck, Garen knew this person was a slave. It wasn't that he wanted to discriminate. That was something very rare to see in his time back in Terran. It was just that the slaves in this world had a really low position. They had such a low status, they were barely even considered humans. It was the type made to eat pig food and sleep on grass on a daily basis. Interacting excessively with a slave you didn't own could get them noticed, and not in a good way. After hesitating for a moment, he turned his head to Jones. Pointing at the cleaner, he said, "He looks very good at cleaning. There are a lot of shoes at home that are in need of major care." Garen looked indifferently at the man behind the counter, furtively giving a handful of silver, but seeming like he wouldn't really care if he couldn't borrow the slave. The man stared at him for a second and took the money without looking at it. "Get him back before closing time." "Got it," he said, and took the man, who they now realized lacked an arm, back to the rented house. "Nope. Tell me what you want to say," Garen asked as he sat in their small living area. At this time, most of the team were out for tasks, and only a few people other than Gil were in the house with him. This included the youngest Lewis as well as the narrow-eyed Mao. As the slave sat still, Garen couldn't help but notice something different. For instance, the locals were inherently taller, but the proportions were the same, unlike with this man. This man was definitely human, but there were slight variations. For example, he had very pudgy fingers for his body type. He had an abnormally long neck. He also seemed to have a larger and bulkier upper body, to the point of disproportion. The most noticeable feature was probably the slightly blue tint to him, though it could also be he was just very pale and lacked melanin. These differences weren't big, but they were there. If noticed, however, most people would just assume he had a very odd body type. Similarly, the Aborigines also came in different skin tones and body builds, otherwise his team's variety of color would have gathered excessive attention. In terms of appearance, except for the size, they were basically identical to the indigenous humans here. The man was silent for a while before looking at each of them one by one, similarly observing. No one spoke for a moment until the slave spoke out, "You're not from this continent." It was a statement. Everyone's back straightened, and they looked at him warily. A few even had a weapon at arm's length. "How'd you know?" they asked, guarded. Although most Aborigines knew they weren't from anywhere nearby, it was never assumed that they were not of this world at all. This made them look at this man with a little hostility and a boatloads of guardedness. The man, however, did not flinch under their stares. He simply paused and closed his eyes, as if recalling thousands of painful memories. "I know because you weren't the only ones," he said. "Because 20 years ago, I had been asking the same things you are." What? It was Gil who talked this time. The man's eyebrows furrowed and clenched his fists, obviously images of a distant, painful past passed by his head. I mean, this wasn't the first time people from other places got transferred here. There was a whole civilization that was transferred 20 years ago, and there was one probably 100 years prior. Garen couldn't help but lean closer. Is there a way back? The man shook his head. Even if there was, you would find nothing. A horrible foreboding filled up their souls. Garen closed his eyes to calm himself. Heaving a sigh, he looked at the old man. However, by habit, he couldn't help question the authenticity of everything first. How come only you could tell us about it? The old man looked at him deeply. There are a lot of people who know. It's just that they're either slaves or way up high the ladder. Gil and Garen looked at each other with deeply tense stances. Can you tell us what happened to these civilizations? He said, baritone voice shaking imperceptibly. Tell me about how you got here, the slave said, and Gil told him about their story. The very reason odd space fluctuations occurred was because a galaxy was about to end. He said, in my planet, these space fluctuations made a mess of the planet's terrain, making the already ongoing disasters even worse. Our planet suffered a catastrophe, supposedly got lucky, and survivors were transferred here to get a last chance of life. The man uttered out the last sentence in sarcasm. Of course, they were brought somewhere that still killed them off, regardless. He paused and looked Garen in the eye. I wouldn't be surprised if it just happened again, he told them, almost with certainty. Garen was silent, trying to keep himself calm, his hands clenching each other. Gil heaved a sigh and turned to the man, wanting to ask more. You mean our people? The people from your home, if they survived, that is, they are most likely already here. Character interaction corner. Garen stares. Where's my wife? Author, she's fine, just answer their questions. Garen, what questions? Author, Sayum, what's your favorite color? Why? Garen, emerald, they remind me of my wife's eyes. Author, okay, what's your hobby? Garen, cooking, so I can cook good food for my wife. Author, what's your favorite part of the day? Garen, bedtime, so my wife and I can. Author, stop, this story is rated PG. Garen, cuddle and chat about our day. Author, stares awkwardly at the audience. Well, you can just ask him what you want. Can't guarantee he'll answer well though. Chapter 87, Realization. The people from your home, if they survived, that is, are most likely already here. If this was true, Garen and the rest couldn't help but recall what they experienced when they first arrived. Being surrounded strong monsters they couldn't do anything about, monsters they could only run from, affected their psyche quite early on. The dangers and horrors they had to go through broke a lot of tough soldiers. How many people had died and how many people lost a part of themselves, they could no longer quantify. And these were all soldiers who had undergone strict trainings and had seen a lot of blood. None of them could imagine what their families had to suffer if they really were transferred here. Garen's blood turned cold just thinking of those damned monsters chasing his wife. Strong fire blazed inside of him, and he wanted to jump outside and kill all those damned monsters that could threaten her safety. That is all I could tell you, the old man said, pulling them all out of their daze, and he just stayed seated in place. Garen heaved a sigh, forcing himself to calm, and looked at him with deep eyes. You know more, he said, a statement. What do you need? By me. What? Let me join your group, the old man repeated, his eyes unlike the lifeless ones he adorned while mopping the floor. His eyes were absolutely determined. An hour later, they brought the old man back to their dwelling with a sigh. They lost 50 gold just like that. Garen massaged his temple as they walked back to their cramped living room. The man did not sit down, as always, by habit, as a normal slave did. Garen did not ask him to be casual either. He simply raised his hand and gestured for the older man to speak. Continue. The man nodded and unconsciously patted his empty sleeve. My name is Gordy. My planet was called Nova. It was water planet consisting of 90% water, back when it still existed. This made Garen and his team pause, and they realized the previous transfer apparently had involved him on a deeper level than they expected. It also explained, to some degree, his odd body structure. Garen mused he must have very strong lungs to be around water his whole life. Before everything, our planet was already facing extinction-level catastrophes for a decade, until only a fraction of the population was left. He could still remember the events like it was yesterday. He was still a young lad at the time, but the terror and hopelessness he experienced was ingrained in his bones. There were various natural disasters that happened every single day. Not one day was missed. Sometimes it was tremors that destroyed mountains. Sometimes it was volcano eruptions that spewed poisonous ashes everywhere. It could also be tsunamis that destroyed everything in its path. Every day, humans kept being reminded of how small they were in the grand scheme of things. After a few years, things even got worse. As I mentioned, we later found out to be the space distortions, and we lost half of the remaining population within a course of a week. Then, we all got these sounds inside our heads, each and every one of us. It informed us of an imminent transfer to a new world. He remembered how people celebrated this news. Anything was better compared to the perilous world they lived in. A few hours later, we found ourselves here, being mobbed by a new set of monsters. Our people lived predominantly in waters, with our planet made of islands that slowly sank down as the catastrophes happened. He said, we were already inferior in strength, and we were taken to a deeper disadvantage due to the terrain. About half of the survivors died in a single day, and it was still in the so-called protection period. This captured the soldiers' apt attention. Protection period. Gordy nodded. Every transfer there is a protection period, and will be open to the rest of the world after this time. That was when the real tragedy started. He closed his eyes, sighing deeply, body shaking a little at the memories, surprisingly still so vivid in his mind. Not only were the monsters suddenly so much stronger, but we were faced with a new unexpected enemy, humans. I remembered the first Aborigine we encountered. We somehow knew the language spoken, as if a translator was installed in our heads. He said, and the others nodded. They too had a similar skill of immediately understanding spoken language. We were apprehensive, of course, but more hopeful. Gordy continued, in our world where nature itself was the enemy, there was barely any serious infighting. To survive, everyone had to unite. In our naive, foolish minds, people with similar appearances were allies. He shook his head, as if remembering their silly appearances. Very soon, we understood this was not the case. Many times, people were even harsher enemies than monsters. We quickly found out how lowly they thought of us, weaklings, and they made sure to let us feel our shortcomings. They also blamed us for the beast tide that attacked the surrounding territories because of our appearance. Gordy had begun to sob at this point, hand covering his eyes, but the rest could see the possible parallelism of his history to theirs. The people of my planet did not last a year. Thousands of territories perished months after the protection period ended. Now we are either dead or slaves. For 20 years I have not heard of an exception. The irony was our existence had been so small that probably a few territories nearby where we appeared had an impression of us. I was one of the last survivors, and I had gathered some information before our territory fell. I've heard that, including the one from 100 years ago, a lot of the low-level existences here were descendants from us foreigners, at least had the blood of them. That was to say, newcomers would not live a good life. Even if they did, they'd have gone through hell to get there, and even their descendants were no exception. This was seen for 100 years, and it was unlikely to change unless the newcomers grew strong enough very, very quickly. Garen felt complicated. He hoped she was here, avoiding the supposed catastrophe in Terran, but at the same time he didn't want her to face all of these. But it did not take long for Garen to get himself together and clear his mind. He didn't have to make things so complicated. As long as they were together, no matter what, he'd just have to protect her. Chapter 88, Weird Fog. The atmosphere was tense and heavy, and no one in the room spoke until the door was opened. It was Jake, who still miraculously had spiky hair. Boss, Bart got news. He paused and looked at the somber people who weren't speaking at all. What happened? Garen rubbed his temple. What is it? Jake flinched, straightening up his back. Bart, he's asking to see you. The heavy atmosphere in the room did not dissipate, but it did put a pause in their useless overthinking and worries. Garen took a moment to gather himself psychologically before standing up and following after Jake. I was just getting back from my short mission when one of the Rollands pulled me over. Garen nodded without speaking and allowed Jake to lead him to the Roland's mercenary headquarters. They walked to one of their gathering rooms and saw that Bart was waiting with two men. One was very tall and thin, and Jake imagined him to be like a human mantis. Beside him was a chubby man with balding hair. And Bart, in his usual flabby self, looked a little serious this time. He pointed at the tall man first, and then to the man beside him. This here is Hoy and his right-hand man Webb. His team is based in Farrell Town, near the border. He paused, looking at Garen with an uncharacteristic grim expression. There's something that happened there the past few days that might interest you, he said, and then turned to look at the man beside him. Hoy began speaking to Garen. You must have heard of the beast tide that happened in different territories, right? Garen nodded, and Hoy continued speaking. The investigators traced that all the beast originated from one area, he said, and there seems to be some kind of changes in there that caused a great disturbance to the mobs around. The Terrans looked at them in interest, waiting eagerly for the next information. This time it was Bart that spoke up. We're heading there to see, are you going? They didn't even need to consider, of course they would go. Immediately, Garen turned to Jake and Gil, who straightened their spines by habit at his impending order. Call the rest of the team, all of them. Yes. They would all want to come. After all, this was the closest they had been to home. They arrived at the feral town a day later after rushing, and without rest. This was one of the few clues they got after so much searching and living at the minimum. No one could stomach staying in one place for so long. After a short rest and restocking in the town, they headed further inland. At first, it was just an endless forest and an occasional mob, nothing special, until they eventually saw the curtain of clouds that seemed to extend from ground to the sky. What a weird fog, Bart mumbled, and they eventually got close to a small makeshift camp not far away. It was composed of various mercenary teams trying to study this thing. There was also several military camps around this fog. Everyone was trying to figure out how much danger it could pose to them. Hoy walked to a group which was apparently members of his mercenary team. What did you discover so far? Has anyone gone inside? The men shook his head. None of us could enter. Well, technically we can, it's just that we exit the same way a few seconds later. There had been no exceptions. Garen frowned and looked up. It so happened that there were a few birds entering the cloud. He waited for the so-called exit, but he quickly realized the birds did not get out. But animals can enter, he voiced out. Everyone turned to him. What? I saw that the birds were unhindered. This made everyone pause and think. Perhaps there are rules, Gil mumbled with narrowed eyes. Bart nodded and looked at his teammates as well as Hoy. Let's try it out. For the remainder of the day, the group experimented on the entry conditions. Garen had entered himself, and it was indeed a bit evil. He entered, but a few steps and he was out back where he was. His teammates did as well, but there was no change. Let's try some other creatures, Bart said, and he ordered a couple of his people to gather creatures and animals for testing. As they waited, Garen's sharp cerulean eyes stared at the ground, and he turned his head to Gil. Ask them to dig. Gil blinked and, realizing what the captain might be trying to see, immediately moved and mobilized a few men to dig below the cloud. All Earth elementalists were mobilized, and soon a trench 20 meters deep was created. But without change, there was this cloud extending below it, as if liquid that was intent on blocking whatever passage they could think of. Soon batches of different animal types and levels were carted in by the various mercenary teams. While this was going on, Garen brought Gordy somewhere to ask, was this familiar? Gordy shook his head. I cannot say. I have been so focused on surviving that these details went past us. He was not lying. He knew there was a protection period because of the announcement and the fact that their surviving population halved as soon as it was over. But he never knew how this protection was implemented at all. Garen sighed and continued watching as the investigation progressed. Eventually, they found the rule. Only levels 3 and above are blocked. Bart looked around and pondered if there was someone who was level 3. No luck, unsurprisingly. Generally, level 3 would be kids on average. They couldn't send children to the unknown, right? Hearing the blockage, the team, except Garen, who just rubbed his forehead, looked at each other in dismay. This was the first time the soldiers got depressed for leveling up. It was Gil who was actually the most rational. "This is a good thing, idiots." They glared at him and he rolled his eyes, continuing his explanation. "If Terrans are really there, it means they won't be facing enemies above level 3. Oh, this calmed down everyone's moods. After all, they could all have loved ones in there. Garen didn't say anything for a while before heaving out a sigh. After thinking a while, he placed another order. "We will set up base in Feral Town." "Yes." Knowing there was no use to stay here, everyone packed up, preparing to go back to a territory. As they walked away, Garen couldn't help but pause and turn back to take another look. He stared deeply at the mysterious fog. "Althea, are you there?" Chapter 89, Furnitures. 26 days of protection period. Althea turned her head in a direction, as if in a daze. Her pretty eyebrows furrowed and her green eyes, reminiscent of the vibrant forest she was facing, focused blankly in space, as if looking for something that could not be seen. Harold, who was asking the workers to move the sofa a little to the left, noticed Althea's blank stare outside the window. He blinked and turned to see what she was looking at. Nothing. "Boss." Althea flinched and turned her head back to their chef and to the interior of the house. "It's nothing," she just said, looking at the status of the fit-out works, turning her attention back to the rooms that were slowly being refurbished. A lot of the smaller furniture was already built off-site, Baron's residential workshop, and were just moved by some manpower. For example, the side tables, the dining chairs, and the coffee table were already in place. There were also baby and child-related furniture like the stair fence, the cribs, and the high chairs. On the other hand, the few varieties that could not fit through the door were assembled on site, like the sofas, her queen-size bed, and the bunk beds. There were also rocking chairs, just because. What was interesting was the amount of detail they placed. Each furniture had an overarching theme, which made everything fit together visually. In their home, Baron placed the cloud and plants motifs. Each leg and siding would have these carvings, and they were quite detailed. It was amazing because it had only been a few days. Anyway, because they were his benefactors and neighbors who paid well, Baron placed them on the priority list of production, still with customization bonuses like the motifs. Baron had already mobilized his whole team and hired a lot of hands to quickly meet their requirements. Of course, he never failed to visit every few hours to personally check on the progress, without missing a short chat with Sheila, of course. Speaking of, he seemed to have entered before Althea entered a daze. She turned to see that he was still there, low-key flirting with Sheila, who was obviously been very oblivious to his advances. For instance, Baron would say, "They say that the sunset here is particularly beautiful because of the 2 moons. How lovely would it be to watch with someone?" "Oh, that's nice," Sheila would say, eyes on the furniture, making sure there was no mistake. "You are very beautiful." Oh, thanks." Althea smiled and shook her head as she resumed watching the people working. At this rate, the sofa and the beds would be completed by noon. If they worked overtime, they could even finish some other furniture. She extended her dainty arms to touch the surface of the upholsteries. Baron's team had somehow managed to get an expert tanner to handle monster hide and turn it into leather and cloth. As for the innards of the cushions, they used feathers and furs of avian monsters. Each of the beds, sofas, and chairs would have these, and it could be said to be very comfortable, at least compared to how they have been sleeping before. Cotton was unfortunately out of their league for now, but Althea felt she should be able to find a way. The thought of a well-furnished home excited her very much. If they managed to turn the multitude of hemp-like plants inside and outside the territory, they should also be able to produce cloth as well. There was plenty of work to be done, but she wasn't panicking. She could tell everything was on track. Anyway, before Baron left, depressed due to being unable to secure a date. He promised to complete the job the next day. He still had a lot of jobs with them alone, after all. For instance, next in line to the house would be her grocery store, then Sheila's clinic, and finally Harold's restaurant. Although there was a green-tagged chef cook as a competitor, the market was huge, and she had the advantage of knowing local ingredients. Not to mention, the said chef had yet to develop his commercial unit, despite being able to afford it. Why? Obviously because of the lack of materials and ingredients. Raw ingredients and material fabrication was the major market she hoped to develop the most. No matter what specialization, these would be the first line of requirements, and was a very good way to make stable money. Walking to the veranda, Althea looked at the farm. They had also ordered a ton of fences to separate the plants, trellises for the crawling plants, and there was even a cute swing for the children. Even at this early stage, one could already see the future loveliness of their villa. Taking back her line of thought to the plants, she decided that for now, she would be testing the plants, local and terran, within her walls. There was only the problem of labor, however. She turned her head and looked at Harold, who was still nitpicking about the furniture. Other than being a supervisor, he seemed to be a little idle now that his restaurant wasn't opened yet. "Harold," she called, just as he discussed to the foreman what he wanted for his restaurant. "Yes, boss." "You realize you can't serve anything in your restaurant without ingredients, right?" Harold was silent, not sure about the sudden question, but nodded in the end. Althea then smiled and took out several plants and seeds. They were all nearly arranged and marked accordingly. There were even color codes to determine which was indigenous versus which one were terran. Harold admired the boss over compulsiveness, but otherwise he had no idea what to do. "Okay, boss," he asked, waiting for instructions. Althea smiled very beautifully. "Plant this for me." Character interaction corner. "Harold, I remember when I was a kid, I used to like picking plants a lot. I used to turn them into beards or mustaches, making me feel manly and stuff." "Althea, that's perfect, hands over seeds." Harold. Chapter 90, Farming. After a while of detailed instruction giving, Harold finally began planting the different plants according to the directions Althea gave. Althea asked him to do two approaches. One was with a nursery, while the other was to directly plant the seeds on the system's soil. In fact, the past few days, other than doing a few hours of training every day, Althea had already began with her nursery, but it was focused on a couple of local plants, and she decided it was time to try more varieties. Althea assisted with this task, where he only had to gather soil in a specific spot in the system farm and place them on makeshift containers carved out from soft porous rocks, which would temporarily be their pots until they found a better alternative. The boss did the rest of the planting and recording. After being dismissed, he then went on to work on the second phase of the experiment. The farm itself was around 600 square meters, and he held a rough plan of how the plants would be zoned. There were also basic instructions on how to garden. For example, since there were no weeds or grass in the system farm, he only needed to loosen the soil with a makeshift tiller they made from twigs. He also added some compost to certain areas, but not everything, because the boss wanted to know the effect of fertilizers on system farms. After tilling and loosening the soil, it was time for him to dig and start planting. It was around this that he heard his daughter's immature voice. Maya jumped out, squatting beside him trying to get the shovel from him. "Let me help Daddy," she said, taking the shovel and helping him dig. She must have thought he still had his old back problems, which was now non-existent thanks to their upgraded physiques. "My Maya is so sensible." He smiled and didn't reject her kindness. The world had changed now, he couldn't baby her like he used to. Letting her help with things like this was doing her a favor. The boss told him specific instructions on how to handle each seed and plant, and he made sure to follow it to the T. There were also plenty of experimental conditions, and he knew it was integral to the territory that he did it correctly, so he did all the planting by himself. Of course, the others could be given to his hyper daughter. "Can I be in charge of watering?" Maya grew up the daughter of a servant. She had always been willing to serve, not to mention she was just doing her part. Maya was a very good girl. Althea smiled as the two bonded over farming and turned her attention to the crops in the nursery. The nursery basically consisted of sensitive plants that she had to monitor herself, a lot of which were indigenous plants. As for the ones in the farm, there were also the same plants as the ones in the nursery, but also plants she judged to be resilient. This was also to test whether soil taken out of system farms was still any good. In any case, the 600 SQM was divided into 12 lots. 8 out of 12 will be given to the yam-like and wheat-like plants. However, there were differences in their conditions, like different spacing, water, depth, etc. to determine which conditions these plants grew best. The rest would be other edible plants, herbs, vegetables, and fruits. For example, berries. One was the blueberries similar to Terran blueberries, the other was the yew berry, and another ultra-sweet berry they found on the way here. There was what she called warmelon. It looked a lot like watermelon, only yellow, and had an effect of warming up the insides like turmeric tea. Speaking of tea, she had also taken a few bushes of tea potential plants, but she planted them near the fences. As for herbs, mostly she took in herbs that could be used as spices and condiments. They also have their own medicinal properties, of course, much of which was still ongoing experiments. This was a particularly sensitive area and would require most of her attention, something she could not yet give at the moment, unfortunately. She also kept half of her nursery for Terran seeds. Of course, she did not dare use all of the seeds lest she lose them all. She just planted a few experimental products for now. Satisfied with the planting plan, she gave every crop a one-over. With the insane refresh of this world added with the 20% field bonus, the plants should all be ready within a few days. By that time, she and Eugene would have perfected some basic processing tools so they could sell the processed food at the grocery store. In addition to these, she would sell condiments and other things in the future. She made a rough calculation and knew that her little farm would not be enough to sustain the potential population the territory could absorb. She decided to invest in 100 more farms, building them side by side in the agricultural zones. She rented the nearest 10 fields for herself. For the farms, she wasn't planning on selling them, only rent them out. They were too important to the territory to give to others. She turned to Sheila, who was arranging some dried herbs as per her request. "Sheila, can you do me a favor and post a job notice in the village center?" The announcements tab was not limited to the Lord. Citizens could also post, but for a price of 1 silver for every 100 words. "Let's hire some farming hands. Those with experience in farming, gardening, and agriculture are welcome. The salary will be 50 copper a day. Let's add those to help us in the grocery store. You can also attach manpower you need in your respective stores," she said, enumerating the various types of labor they would need. "Got it," she said, properly putting away the plants. Speaking of which, judging by the number of people coming by the day, production would eventually be required. She looked at the map and mused she should at least add an industrial area. The quantity of the processing of different fields would definitely need this space. Even after all of these, she still had so much to do. But she was feeling quite excited.